All right, so we are continuing on. We have just covered McLean and Stewart, America's Dilemmas, and I'm just starting at the beginning of the lesson plan so you can see how we got to where we are. We've also covered LeMay, Basic Concepts of Majority-Minority Relations. Those are both in video 2.1. Now we are moving on to video 2.2, and we are going to talk about chapters 1 and 2 in your textbook. Chapter 1 focuses on a changing America. So keeping the information in mind that we've just covered, thinking about the dilemmas that run throughout American politics, and the way that majority and minority groups are constructed, and that includes racial groups. Once we keep that in mind, then we can turn our attention to learning more about how America has been changing over time. And that's what chapter 1 is really focusing on. A changing America. So it's really looking at 4 different key categories to describe how America is changing. And those categories are age, population diversity, geography, and income. So with regards to age, the main thing that you need to know is that the population is aging, getting older. So your book talks about the fact that there will be over 55 million people who are 65 and up by the year 2020. So that's a major increase, and you may have heard of the group called the baby boomers. This is just kind of building on that idea that as the population ages, when we think about politics, it's important to note that because that helps you understand which groups may be more politically active, and in terms of their numbers, which groups might have more political power. Also remembering what we talked about before with regard to majority and minority groups, numbers don't necessarily equate to political power, but sometimes you can have large groups like seniors that are also politically active. And so the combination of having higher numbers and being politically active does put them in an important position. Next, we'll talk about population diversity. And really, the focus here is on immigration. The fact that earlier immigrants, while they came mostly from Europe, more recent immigrants are coming from Latin America or Asia. So that's one significant way that things have changed. And kind of similar to how it was previously, though, immigrants are still concentrated in low wage occupations. They earn sometimes only half as much as American citizens for doing the same work. And with regards to children, there are 4 million children who are immigrants to the United States or whose parents are immigrants, and those children are U.S. citizens. So immigration continues to be an important topic because we think about the way that the immigrant population is changing, but also the fact that it's such a large population. And of course, we see that in the news today, which we'll be able to talk about in class. Geography. So the population is shifting from what was called the Rust Belt into what we now call the Sun Belt, moving from the Midwest and from the North into the South and the Southwest, areas where the weather is warmer. That's why it's called the Sun Belt. For an example, the Northeast and Midwest states, they actually lost seats in the House of Representatives because it's measured by population and people had moved from those states into other states. So it's very important to pay attention to where people are moving from and where they're moving to. Also important to note that 80% of Americans now live in urban areas. So in addition from moving from Northeast and Midwestern states, they're also moving from rural areas and into urban areas. Income is the next key category. And we have to, when we talk about income, we have to consider the fact that there are growing income disparities. So I've listed a few categories here for you. They are talked about briefly in your book as well. Gender, education, and employment are a few of the key categories where there are income disparities. So that's important for you to know. With regard to gender, women, one reason why there's a gender disparity in income is because women often leave their careers to have children or to care for elders. And so coming back into the workforce, they're often paid less money. Also, jobs that are considered women dominated often just pay less money. And there is also the issue of the income gap, the fact that women only make, I believe it's 77 cents for every dollar that men make. So these are some of the factors that contribute to this disparity. With regards to race and education, you can look at educational levels in the United States, and when you look at them by race, you see disparities in terms of Asian Americans and white Americans having more education than African Americans and Hispanic Americans or Latinos. So that's a disparity because education is still linked to a certain amount of income. Also, education is linked to other political factors in terms of an individual's willingness to be involved with the political system. And then employment, there are also disparities in employment as far as discrimination against both minorities and women. So when you have these disparities or differences, it makes a huge impact on who is able and willing to participate in the political system, who has access to resources, which we talked about a little earlier in the other video, those kinds of things. So income and income disparities is an important aspect of the way that America is changing. And then building on that, we go here to poverty, the topic of poverty. And I have some information here for you from the Federal Safety Net website. And it's information on the 2016 poverty guidelines, different statistics that you can collect, and you may also want to use them for your team projects. So, poverty rates among minority groups and women-headed households are higher than among other groups, another disparity, another big factor in terms of how Americans experience the political system. So here's just a list of statistics. I won't read them for you, but I'll point out a few. So a four-person family is said to live in poverty if they make $24,250 or below. So anyone making above that in a four-person family is considered not to be in poverty. As far as the population goes, 13.5% of the entire U.S. population lives in poverty. But then when we break that down, we see 28% of single mothers are living in poverty. Here we have the racial statistics. All children, 20% of all children are living in poverty. So that's key, something for you all to think about depending on your topic. Also, single dads, 15% of them are living in poverty. So this website can provide you with some useful information if you want more to learn more about the poverty guidelines and information about different groups. So that's a changing America in a nutshell. And then the last section in this module focuses on the American Constitution. So how and why it was created, and especially four key principles on which it is based. And we'll also talk a bit about American and American Indian relationships, because those were being formed in some of the same periods that we'll be talking about, the colonial period and the Revolutionary War period. So moving on to the American Constitution, our last section of this module. Thinking about how the Constitution was created, we start with the colonial period. 1607 was when the first colony was founded, and then the colonial period goes all the way up to 1775. During this time, the colonists lived under British rule. They considered themselves British citizens, and so they had a certain amount of self-rule as well. They were allowed to elect their own governors. They were allowed to use some of the taxes that they collected for their own benefits there in the colony. But of course, they did have to send money to Britain as well. However, the British had debt from fighting the wars with various American Indian tribes. They called them the Indian Wars. They were also trying to govern territories that they held in Canada, and they were trying to enforce treaties that had been created through those Indian Wars. So various treaties with Native Americans. Westward expansion was one reason that the conflicts occurred, but it was also supposed to be limited by these treaties so that Native Americans or American Indians and the colonists and the British could live in peace. However, since all of these things were happening, the British decided to change their taxation policy. So in 1763, the British decided to make colonists pay new taxes, more taxes for administrative fees so that they could collect the money to pay their debts. They also asked them to pay more so that British troops could be housed in the colonies. The colonists saw these taxes as a violation of their rights. They did consider themselves to be British citizens, but since they were not represented in Parliament, They felt that it was unfair that they were expected to pay so much to the British. So this is where the phrase "no taxation without representation" comes from. And their outrage over this is what led to the Revolutionary War. So this is the second period that we're studying in Chapter 2, Revolutionary War period, which lasted from 1775 to 1783. So the Continental Congress was the first kind of pre-constitutional body that was created. This was created so that the colonies, as they decided that they wanted to go to war with Britain, they wanted to at least have some kind of a loose alliance. So the word states is in quotes because they weren't officially states, but they were moving in that direction and deciding that they wanted to have an alliance so that they could work together to fight against the British. So this Continental Congress, it included a unicameral legislature, which meant one state got one vote, or one kind of former colony, so semi-state got one vote. It also drafted it during this Continental Congress. The Articles of Confederation were drawn up. They were drafted in 1781, and what they did was they offered a plan for the colonies to come together into a nation. However, there were several problems with the Articles of Confederation. They're often criticized as being weak and very problematic. A few of the problems: they required all of the states to approve the articles in order for them to be ratified. So that means all of the 13 colonies, former colonies, had to go ahead and approve and say that they supported the articles. So it was important to get everyone to buy in. They created a very weak national government. So they could not, this national government, it couldn't keep states from printing their own currency. So you can imagine there was no regulation from one state to another. If you traveled, then your money might be useless if you go across state lines into another state. They couldn't enforce the peace treaty with Britain. So even though this was, supposed to be a movement towards coming together to create a nation, and nations are supposed to be able to enforce their treaties, these Articles of Confederation didn't allow the national government any kind of power to enforce the treaty. The government also didn't have the power to collect taxes, which was very important, so they only relied on the state contributions. And if the states did not contribute, then the national government didn't have any funds. And finally, it didn't include any executive or a judiciary branch. There was only a unicameral legislature, which you see here. And unicameral, uni means one, cameral means house, so there was only one house. So then we move on to kind of the process that continued after the Articles of Confederation were created. We often refer to our democracy as Madisonian because he was one of the principal architects to creating the Constitution. When the colonists realized that the Articles of Confederation were pretty weak, problematic, and that they needed to be revised, Madison was one of the principal architects, and so our system is referred to often as a Madisonian system. And he was very concerned with what he saw as a couple of threats to liberty. So he wrote the Federalist Papers, among other documents, trying to get support for this idea of creating a stronger constitution. And what he was thinking is that he wanted to create a government and create a constitution that addressed these two threats to liberty. The first is factions, which is the idea that there are special interests, small groups kind of within the population that are willing to pursue their own interests at the expense of everyone else's. He was afraid that small groups would be able to gain power and then kind of lead the rest of the population wherever they wanted to go. He was also worried about excessive concentration of political power in the hands of government officials. He did not want government officials to be able to kind of rule from their ivory towers and be able to ignore what the will of the people was. So a couple of remedies that he came up with and that were embedded in our Constitution. They're called 4 key constitutional principles. So this is what we're going to go over now. The first constitutional principle is separation of power. So keep in mind the fears that Madison had, and these 4 principles were meant to address those fears. Separation of power divides power among 3 branches of government, not just one, which the Articles of Confederation created, but 3 branches. I see that we're at 14 minutes and 32 seconds and my video can only be 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and pause and I'll make another video covering the four constitutional principles.